From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the European Division, Library of Congress, and I'm Grant Harris. I'm head of the European Reading Room, and we're very pleased to have Paul Miller here today to talk to us on, I don't have actually in front of me, there it is, Warren the Duke, the Sarajevo Assassination in History, Memory, and Myth. And I apologize for not having a larger room. I should have known that Paul Miller's star power would bring a large group in here. I've always been impressed with Paul's lectures, and that's true. I'd just like to say Paul is at McDaniel College, an associate professor there. His Ph.D. is in modern European history at Yale University. His dissertation, From Revolutionaries to Citizens, Antimilitarism in France, 1870-1914. And that was published by Duke University Press. In 2004 and 2005, he was a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Sarajevo, where he wrote on and taught genocide issues. From 2011 to 2013, Paul was a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Birmingham in England, where he researched and later published his work on the memory of the Sarajevo Assassination. And I've been very pleased that I was able to include Paul Miller in a talk we had a couple of years back, I think, a panel discussion on Sarajevo. In this building, and I'm pleased that we have him here again to talk. And so I'll just turn this over now to you, Paul. Thank you for being here.
Yeah,
again.
Thank you very much, Grant.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, and thanks to your terrific staff here for organizing this, and thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon. Grant actually said to me, is there any way you could tie this in with an American theme? So first of all, I should draw attention to the fact that Franz Ferdinand is a band. Some of you probably already know that, so hence this is a band poster. The band has nothing to do with the Sarajevo assassination per se. They're in Scotland. But this is already not working. Oh, because I have to turn it on. How do I turn it on? I'm sorry. There it is. Okay. So as an American theme, I thought, what better to start with than the Jewish-Hungarian-American Harry Houdini. And there he is doing one of his escape acts, the famous magician escape artist. The very day Franz Ferdinand and his wife were shot to death in Sarajevo, the world-famous magician Harry Houdini was hanging upside down in a straitjacket 12 stories over New York City's Times Square. It's another picture. The ecstatic crowd was holding its collective breath as the escape artist performed one of his most audacious and dangerous acts. 4,000 miles away, another energized crowd was ravaging Serb property in the Bosnian capital. There too, if less literally, danger was in the air. But even Houdini was not above the melee as he dangled above Midtown Manhattan. On the contrary, the great conjurer was in the midst of, quote, the one genuine mystical experience of his life, end quote. It came in the form of a memory triggered by news of the Archduke's assassination. From inside the straitjacket's darkness, Houdini suddenly visualized a scene from 6 summers earlier, when on a Sunday drive through the New York suburbs, his auto had overheated just opposite a house where a little boy was playing outside. While the liveried chauffeur refilled the radiator, the legendary illusionist had refreshed his thirst inside with the family. It was as he was leaving that the now remembered moment occurred. The boy, entranced like all children by the magician, had followed him into the street and was standing before the car staring at his distorted macrocephalic reflection in the shiny brass fitting of the headlight. "Goodbye, Sonny," said Houdini. "Warn the Duke," replied the boy. Then he ran off. The magician had not given the cryptic utterance a single thought since, not even when he met the Archduke Franz Ferdinand at an air show in Germany a year later. So, this is exactly the kind of story that the American writer E.L. Doctorow likes to insert into his fiction, one in which cosmic design lurks just beneath the outward arbitrary look of things, and the characters themselves remain largely oblivious to it. In his work Ragtime, as in the Sarajevo Assassination, accident and intention intersect at the very spot Houdini's car sputtered and swerved into the curb. But when the little boy who just happened to live there transmits an authentic message from beyond, the eminent illusionist fails to recognize it. Thus, missing this signal from a real-life mystic, the boy, the fake one, Houdini, forfeits its chance to change history by alerting Franz Ferdinand and averting the flashpoint of global catastrophe. Only at the end of the novel, on the day the Duke is murdered and the moment Houdini is immobilized in midair, does the magician sense that he may have been tripped up by something truly magical. As far as we know, there was nothing supernatural about the Sarajevo assassination, and yet every aspect of it has a whiff of the otherworld, from the many warnings the Archduke did receive to the way events unfolded that day. The barely evaded bomb, for example. The fact that Count Harrach got on the running board later in the day to protect Franz Ferdinand, but he was on the wrong side. And the famous wrong turn that you've all heard about. Franz Ferdinand himself had a superstitious streak, once relating how a fortune teller had prophesied that he would, quote, someday unleash a world war. But the Archduke was above all an ardent Catholic who, whenever given a grim account of the security situation, confidently fell back on his faith. Quote, our lives are constantly in danger, he told his Chari chief of staff on April 18th, 1913. One just has to trust in God, end quote. On June 28th, 1914, God clearly was not on the successor's side. Fate, destiny, design, doom. These are the usual stuff of memory rather than history. They are also a big part of how we process the Sarajevo assassination and, in the process, transmute it from historical event into mythologized moment. Fictional and figurative works like Ragtime do this deliberately, if at times subtly, inserting a scene, phrase, image, character, or storyline that alludes to some aspect of Sarajevo and then leaves readers to reflect on meaning, assuming that they haven't missed the metaphor altogether. Selden Edwards' successful novel, fantasy novel, The Little Book, is another interesting instance of this. While the work mainly tracks a time-traveling teenager from 1988 San Francisco to 1897 Vienna, it opens with a scene evoking the very deed that, in so many depictions, undid the era that enraptures the author. In the scene, a 10-year-old protagonist is walking in the wilderness with his mother when he spies a hawk hovering at about 100-foot distance. Reflexively, as little boys are wont to be, he picks up a stone and, quote, in one beautifully unified motion, wings it right at the bird, which drops, quote, like an overripe peach, end quote. His mother is aghast. The boy is totally stunned. He can't believe he even came close, let alone laid the bird out. And he's seized by a strange sense of shame and awe. Quote, it was hard to explain, but something began to dawn on him in that moment. He had felt for just an instant the connectedness of all things, end quote. The alert reader might well wonder whether the assassin Gavrilo Princip also experienced such mystical connectedness when his shots hit home. Or more likely, was he clobbered so quickly by the crowd that he had no chance to feel anything? Whatever the upshot, Selden Edwards could have left his audience to its own imaginings. Yet just to be sure that we all got the allegory, he inserts what the boy's mother hopes will be a life lesson for her thunderstruck son. Quote, that such tiny and thoughtless acts of violence were exactly what eventually caused the huge consequences of world war, end quote. The author's choice of adjectives is interesting. Tiny, thoughtless. Certainly in relation to the First World War, the assassination of a single archduke, even if he were heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, may well appear trivial. Yet in its proper geopolitical context, Sarajevo was nothing less than earth-shattering. After all, it had been barely 5 years since Austria's annexation of Bosnia led to the Bosnian crisis, which almost led to a European war. And in light of the nationalist feelings in the region and Serbia's accelerated irredentism since the two Balkan wars in 1912-1913, no one had any illusions as to the danger the Archduke courted when he went to Bosnia, let alone drove through its capital in a convertible on a Serb national holiday. The emperor himself had been stalked by an assassin when he visited Bosnia 4 years earlier. His nephew's murder there 4 years later was anything but thoughtless. It was a highly purposeful act of political violence. Yet rather than censure the novelist, Selden Edwards, whose artistic license arguably allows him some factual leeway, academics and other assumed experts have contributed to the construction of the assassination as tiny and thoughtless. Around the time of the centenary 2 years ago in the New York Times, the Oxford historian Margaret Macmillan referred to the political murder as, quote, a random event in an Austro-Hungarian backwater, end quote. And predating this perspective, there's a 100-year history of reducing Sarajevo to fate, fluke, chance, and accident, and the city itself, along with Bosnia and the Balkans in general, to obscure, savage, primitive, remote, and, in a word, irrelevant. Quote, a ridiculous mouse, the Sarajevo assassination, that improbably induced, quote, towering mountain ranges into labor, wrote one British scholar. In the 1930s, an American journalist decreed it, quote, an intolerable affront to human and political nature that these parochial and miserable and wretched and shriveled little countries in the Balkans can and do have quarrels that cause world wars, end quote. The same holds for the randomness issue, principes and tensions. There is no shortage of scholarly works that use language which easily lends itself to the notion that sheer coincidence brought Franz Ferdinand face to face with his assassin. According to Yale historian and my mentor, John Merriman's highly successful textbook, A History of Modern Europe, Princip just happened to be only a few feet from the Archduke's car, end quote. The historian Hugh Strachan, one of the great historians of World War I, in his book, The First World War, the assassin was, quote, loitering on the corner when the successor's car suddenly appeared. And in an article published, I can give you thousands of examples. In an article published in the recent issue of the Journal of Modern History, the author writes that Gavrilo Princip was, quote, milling about, ruminating on his group's failed attempt when the car suddenly stopped right in front of him. Besides the author's sense that he can read the assassin's mind, the historian, as many before him, also seems to have overlooked the fact that Princip was doing his milling about, or his loitering, at the precise spot the procession was supposed to turn according to the well-publicized itinerary. That's why Princip was standing there. Not to mention the fact that he had a gun and a grenade in his pocket. But was he also eating a sandwich? As the 2003 BBC documentary Days That Shook the World first reported. Well, in case you haven't heard, the conspirators called off their effort after the bomb missed its mark, but Gavrilo Princip, understandably starving from spending, the morning in the hot summer sun, headed to Moritz Schiller's delicatessen for a bite to eat. And here, two destinies collided to steer history in its diabolic direction as Princip turned up from his lunch to see the car stalled squarely in front of him. The only question is why the half-eaten sandwich never made it into a museum, and obviously, what kind of sandwich it was. All right. It's not as whimsical as it sounds. One teacher offered his students extra credit if they could find out what kind of sandwich it was. By the way, all my students incoming now have heard this sandwich story. That wasn't true 10 years ago, but now it is. And besides classrooms, the story has seeped into serious works. One historian, A Concise History of Western Civilization, this is a historian published by a serious academic press, 2011, has The Sandwich. Nicholas Rankin's Oxford University Press published book on British cunning in the Two World Wars, Gavrilo Princip is, quote, consoling himself with a sandwich when the Archduke drops in. And I can give you lots more examples of serious university publisher books. Quote, whoever made the sandwich Gavrilo Princip ate on June 28, 1914 has a lot to answer for. Reads the first sentence of an article in the Los Angeles Times by the science writer for Time magazine. Indeed they do. In the case of the sandwich, the myth moved in the other direction. That is, the story first appeared in a Brazilian novel that just happened to be translated into English at the same time the BBC director was working on his documentary. In other words, you can't find before 2003 any reference to a sandwich. Only in 2003 and after the BBC documentary comes out that you start seeing references to him eating a sandwich as the Archduke's car pulls up. In this novel, by the way, a 12-fingered trained assassin inserts himself into the signal events of the 20th century, and on June 28, 1914, the well-endowed protagonist encounters Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo, and he's eating a sandwich in the novel. So, in these and other ways, then, nonfiction and even scholarly writing contributed to the assassination's mythicization through an inviting infusion of exaggerated language, interpretative overreach, like inbred Balkan barbarism, the inevitable collapse of a European order, etc., recurring canards, like the sandwich, and rhetoric that leads readers directly from that hot sunny day in Sarajevo to those cold muddy trenches of the Western Front. In this regard, quote, the first shots of the First World War, end quote, is a catchy and compelling way to describe the Archduke's peacetime political murder. The expression has thus appeared in countless contexts and configurations, and through all the cultural and political upheaval of the past century. Its ubiquity, however, does not make it true. What it makes it is memorable. In parallel manner, Houdini's personal recollection of the little boy becomes the shared memory of the millions who read Ragtime, a novel that is not even about the Sarajevo assassination as such. What Doctorow's classic, and if you haven't read Ragtime, please do, it's just terrific, like all of Doctorow's novels, I think. What his novel's about, race and the roiling tensions in American identity during the transformative years before the First World War, is realized and enlivened by the author's intrepid combination of actual history, right? Houdini existed, and overt invention. The boy didn't. Most notably, all the characters, whether fictional, like the boy, or historical, like Houdini, are interconnected in a chaotic pattern of coincidence, correspondence, and, as we've seen, occult. Such a setup seems ready-made for Sarajevo, whose maddening mix of randomness, the wrong turn, and predictability, all the warnings that did happen, readily provokes a common comforting assumption that because it happened, it somehow had to. And so too, the great power collision itself. The novel thus taps into two of the assassination's truly mythical registers of remembrance, that it improbably occurred in this preposterous place, and that it directly gave rise to the inevitable Great War. So a little theory now, because this is memory study, so I can't really get away from it, right? Ultimately, of course, it's the latter that matters in terms of the measureless attention we place on this particular political murder. Were it not for the unforetold global fallout from Franz Ferdinand's fatality, then Doctorow's Houdini would not have been told to warn the Duke, right? Whose death would merely have joined the long and lugubrious list of political murders that marked the era. If Princip's pistol shots were not literally the first of the First World War, they were, outrageously, what triggered the crisis that came to it. It's precisely this absurd asymmetry that makes Sarajevo the epitome of what the historian Pierre Nora calls a spectacular event, one, quote, on which posterity retrospectively confers the greatness of origins, the solemnity of inaugural ruptures. Thus, the assassination can be considered a lieu de mémoire, a site of memory supremely suited to contemplating this consequent past. Now, for Pierre Nora, such sites were typically physical spaces with national subtext, and the one where Princip pulled the trigger can certainly be studied as such. But for our purposes, it's the act itself which suffuses popular memory, just like the lethal limo is displayed in a museum, and there it is. I don't know who that kid is. It's my nephew. It's her brother. And just as we crack up clumsily every time the comic explains, quote, Franz Ferdinand found alive, World War I, a mistake. As these select examples suggest, what we commonly compartmentalize as history or memory are not necessarily polarized in the ways we might presume. This point was not always so problematic. Only with the emergence of modernity in the 19th century did scholars begin stressing the strict schism between history and memory. Unlike in earlier epochs, when traditional forms of imparting the past invariably conflated these concepts, people used to pass down history as stories, right, inflating memory and history. History now, in the 19th century, modernity, came to stand for, quote, an ideal of disinterested objectivity, while memory was increasingly regarded as inherently subjective. Then came postmodernism in the late 1970s, with its direct challenge to objective truth. And soon enough, historians were pointing to ways in which their own discipline was beset by subjectivities, conditioned by the confines of language and context. Yet rather than belaboring it, they built upon this insight to begin making a cultural turn, as it's called, in academic milieu towards studying historical representation. So now monuments and museums, commemorative acts, rituals, and even street names were avenues for interpreting the past. Everything from fiction to folklore, film, art, images, textbooks, even children's books became fair game for ferreting out meaning. And in this expansive sense, then, narrative history itself, part of my argument, can also serve as a source for surveying representation, one that's informed and deforms in ways strikingly similar to its alleged other, memory. Make no mistake, I am an historian. History is still history in that its intrinsic intention is understanding. Memory has no such motive. Oh, I should say, history may never be perfectly objective, but it strives for empirical truth. Memory has no such motive. Steeped in meaning, it feeds on our feelings rather than intellect, preys upon passions as opposed to answering questions. That's why memory is regularly associated with place, such as the actual site of the Sarajevo assassination. Politics and time period, too, can radically transform how and what we remember, which is why the site of the assassination has seen 5 memorials and 3 museums in 1 century. Of course, history writing is also influenced by temporal and political context. Just witness the number of recent studies drawing direct analogies to terrorism today. And there are a ton of examples, but the example I'm going to give is the one that came to my attention the most recently, not by an historian, but in the New York Times by Roger Cohen 4 days ago. The Orlando killer, Omar Martin, is the Gavrilo Princip of the early 21st century. Like the 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist whose bullets ignited World War I, Martin has set a spark to a time of inflammable anger. So that's Roger Cohen of the New York Times just a few days ago. So there you have, this is the line I gave a little earlier, and this is academic book Studienverlag is an Austrian academic press, and you see paired the World Trade Center in flames and the Sarajevo assassination. Okay. So if the world changed forever on September the 11th, 2001, then what the heck happened on the 28th instance of June 1914 at 10:50 in the morning? This is the title of a film which I would venture few scholars of the war's origins have ever heard of, let alone actually seen. That's because it has nothing whatsoever to do with the event it's plainly evoking. Rather, this work is a portrait of 2 modern gay artists who are so inspired by the Victorian era that they have turned their entire life work into artwork, living without contemporary conveniences whatsoever, no cell phones, surrounding themselves with a 19th century repertoire of furniture, photographs, musical instruments, dress, utensils, and even historical objects conserved under glass. According to the film's website, the documentary film demonstrates the extent to which the artists' lives are subservient to their quasi-philosophical conception of time. We thus watch them emptying piss pots, mending vintage clothing, and pecking away on manual typewriters, like the one I learned to type on. And yet these scenes are all set in the midst of modern-day Manhattan. So what can we make of this work in the context of coming to terms with the Sarajevo assassination? Is its title merely an intention-grabbing gimmick? By so methodically imposing the past onto the present, are these artists actually just over-nostalgic escapists, naive to the 19th century's gross inequities, which it would have made their lives together as middle-class gay men impossible in the first place? That's certainly one way to see it. Yet I would suggest there's something about the preserved past and the present lives of Peter McGough and David McDermott that's decidedly exhilarating. Not because we want to go back, but because we might have done better with the world. Time is determinative, and its displacement here highlights the radical change that has occurred in the last century. The one that can be conveniently dated to the precise moment that Princip's bullet pierced the heir's bull neck and blood spurted onto his tunic, which is also displayed today in a museum. The blood's fading. It's a moment, moreover, that a wide range of writers, artists, and others have regularly constructed in terms of a definitive break with an idyllic world, or directly blamed for having brought on all the bad in this one. Some of the most amusing examples, and here I'm just going to throw out a few examples, are murder mysteries and related fiction that focuses on solving the crime and saving humanity by stopping the Sarajevo assassination. There are also nonfiction works that do this. Robert Goddard's classic thriller Closed Circle, two World War I veterans find out that there was a conspiracy by some very rich financiers to start a world war, and therefore they would become even richer, and they're trying to track down this conspiracy. There's a counterfictional work that I'm hoping will be translated into English. It was written in German. It's called The Comet in English, and it's a terrific read. It's gotten excellent reviews. It just came out a few years ago. And in the world that's woven in this book, Franz Ferdinand, after the assassination attempt that fails, earlier in the morning, the bomb, he says, what the heck, let's go home. Goes back to Vienna. Vienna and Berlin, of course, there's no Holocaust, so they have their Jewish populations have become the capitals of the world, and America remains cowboy and Indian land, totally primitive, and he weaves this whole tale about how the world develops. It's hilarious. Kids' books do this a lot, too. Actually, my nephew, I gave him this book by British writer Johnny O'Brien, Jack Christie's Adventures, and one of them is The Day of the Assassins, in which two people who invent a time machine go back to try to prevent the Sarajevo assassination, but one decides that no, they shouldn't change history because then we wouldn't exist, then other positive things that happen in the world wouldn't happen, and they have this big argument about whether or not history should be changed. So there's millions of examples like this. Here's another example that gets us back to the American theme. F. Scott Fitzgerald's short story, The Ice Palace, in which there's an oblique reference to, quote, the Serbia, quote, an unknown man who had not had his trousers pressed, end quote. Tellingly, the Serbia's identity is irrelevant to what transpires when this baggy-pantsed man is spotted on a street corner by the story's protagonists. A northerner, think back to the time period Fitzgerald's writing, a northerner named Harry, and his fiancée from the south, Sally. Now this is long before when Harry met Sally, so nothing to do with the film. Harry's from the north, he mischievously reckons the raggedy figure on the street corner a southerner, then launches into a litany of stereotypes about this whole, quote, hang-dog lot of sort of degenerates who've gotten lazy and shiftless from living so long among colored people. Sally, the southerner, can't bear to hear this, and what readers then witness is a clash of worldviews so severe as to bring the betrothed to the brink of a dangerously steep quarrel or war. right? All because of some slovenly man in the street in Harry's wholesome hometown, a stand-in, it seems safe to assume, for the unkempt miscreant who murdered the Archduke and plunged the world, the marriage, into Armageddon. Similarly, the American writer Askold Mellenzuk's novel What Is Told, the protagonist just happened to get married on the day the Archduke and his wife is murdered. The priest, nobody really pays attention. The priest kind of grumbles about the bad weather that day. But once the war comes and the husband is killed, the young wife swears revenge against the Serbian prince. She says in the novel, "Who do these men think they were that she should lose a husband for their sakes?" So that may be quasi-mythical, but it's also an eloquent part of the painful legacy these writers are struggling with. That is, it's much easier to target the Sarajevo assassination than the World War's true culprits, the leaders of Europe's great powers. All men, by the way. And therein lies one myth that has made the Sarajevo murder so memorable. Its causal culmination in the First World War, with all that conflicts, concomitant and consequences from the demise of men to the rise of despots and the destruction of civilization. Here's some quotes. "Except for Sarajevo, writers and scholars both, around the world, actually, across the century, Europe's," quote, this is a scholar, "ascending process of civilized well-being would not have been broken, except for the Sarajevo assassination. Dialogue on women's rights would never have been deferred, except for the Sarajevo assassination. Gandhi's colonial emancipation could not have happened, except for the Sarajevo assassination. Chicago Tribune, 1937, 2 Serbian assassinations and an American massacre." Okay, and who hasn't heard of the sofa, quote, "the sofa on which one could lay the 20th century"? That's the sofa that the Archduke died upon, and for which the Austrian government paid a lot of money in the 1990s to put in the museum. There it is. It's more like a chaise lounge, I guess.
What museum is it?
The Museum of Military History in Vienna. Austrian Museum of Military History. Heeresgeschichtliches Museum in German. The man who made that purchase, Dr. Manfred Rauchensteiner, did so as director of the Austrian Museum of Military History, which has an entire room of assassination relics, including the fateful Otto. Yet as an accomplished historian, Rauchensteiner also reminds us in one of his books, quote, that the murder of Franz Ferdinand did not trigger a war, but rather a European crisis. And this crisis could well have been resolved without global conflagration, as discernibly graver ones were earlier in the era. Is there, then, enough space in public memory to include the failings and foibles of those leaders truly at fault for the World War? Or is it just easier to proclaim Gavrilo Princip, quote, the greatest murderer of all time, and assume that events followed a preordained path? Or as the BBC documentary stated in 1964, the peace of Europe died with the royal pair. In no case, now I'm going to give sort of a case study very quickly, in no case perhaps has this been more true than for Austria, which not only lost the World War, but was forced to forsake its 600-year-old Habsburg Empire. Unsurprisingly, the suddenness of the ageless empire's disappearance gave rise to the type of confusion that typically takes refuge in nostalgia. As what one scholar called old Austrians looked back longingly on, quote, the loss of greatness, harmony, and stability, the end of an idyllic world, an enchanted Middle Europe, Mittel Europa. For the great Austrian novelist Stefan Zweig, it was not the armistice of November 11th, 1918. It was not the signing of the Saint-Germain Treaty on September 10th, 1919, which officially dissolved the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ended it. No, it was June 28th, 1914, when, quote, in a single second, this knowable and dependable, enchanted world was smashed into 1,000 pieces like a hollow clay vessel. Similarly, Austrian efforts to come to terms with Franz Ferdinand's unfinished legacy have commonly constructed him as the first victim of the First World War. And there's lots of quotes to this effect, so I'm going to skip that. There's never been a monument or memorial to Franz Ferdinand in Vienna, let alone a street or a square named for him. But he's been remembered in Austria since 1934 in the Castle Gate on Heroes Square, where you find Austria's official World War I memorial. Okay, it's right there on the left. So this is World War I memorial. This is the tomb of the unknown soldier in Vienna. This is right on Heroes Square. Anybody who knows Vienna has been there. So there. Archduke Franz Ferdinand killed in Sarajevo. But of course, there was no World War going on when he was killed, and that's sort of my point. And in 1986, another marker went up in the Kaiser's crypt. Franz Ferdinand, for various reasons having to do with his morganatic wife, is not buried in the Kaiser's crypt, the imperial crypt. But they put a plaque up in 1986 in remembrance of Franz Ferdinand and his wife, who's also killed, in memory of the first victims of the First World War. So, zum Gedenken an die ersten Opfer des Ersten Weltkriegs is what it says at the top, right? And here it is, and there's Franz Josef's tomb right there, and so that's what it looks like. And this is a tourist place. Every tourist goes to the Kaiser's crypt when they go to Vienna, right, to see all these tombs of the various emperors and empresses. If Austrian popular memory could construct Franz Ferdinand and his Frau as the first victims of the First World War, then why not Sarajevo as the place where the World War began? When in 1927 the great Austrian writer Josef Roth went to Sarajevo, he could not quite bring himself to wish ruin upon it. Why should I? It has good people, beautiful women, marvelously innocent children, pets that are happy to be alive. Yet neither could the author accept Sarajevo's everyday ordinariness. As he also wrote in the Frankfurter newspaper, Zeitung, nonetheless, the war began here and the world is wrecked, and Sarajevo stands. It should not be a city. It should be a monument to make everyone remember with horror. While Sarajevo itself cannot be held accountable for the World War, such modes of remembrance remind us that it cannot be separated from it either. Just as historians sometimes bookend the 20th century between the Sarajevo assassination and the city's siege in the 1990s in order to create a neat explanatory framework for the forces that shaped the era, writers who reflect upon the city in non-scholarly ways also end up shaping its memory, though in ways that are typically more mythic than accurate. Quote, "Look deeply into the history of Sarajevo," wrote the Bosnian author Hamza Humo in 1934, and you will find a city characterized by an atmosphere of protest. For the author, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was nothing less than the heroic culmination of a rebellious mentality that had characterized the Bosnian capital for centuries. Now contrast this with the poem written by the very well-known British writer-poet Lawrence Durrell in 1951, and I'll read it. Where minarets have twisted up like sugar and a river curdled with blonde ice drives on, tinkling among the mule teams and the mountaineers under the bridges and the wooden trellises which tame the air and promise us a peace, harmless with nightingales. None are singing now. No history much? Perhaps. Only this ominous dark beauty flowering under veils, trapped in the spectrum of a dying style. A village like an instinct left to rust, composed around the echo of pistol shot. For Durrell, not a Bosnian, the assassination and the ugly world war it provoked are wholly at odds with the deliciously serene, natural, and prehistorical, pre-modern landscape that he finds in Sarajevo. So which picture of Sarajevo is correct? Was it the fate of this peaceful pre-modern city to become the site of the most famous political murder in modern history? Or was it completely in accord with the Bosnian capital's rebellious nature? Of course, the answer is both and neither, as these myths, like all myths, say more about how we try to make sense of the world than they actually do about the assassination itself. In other words, when history and memory blur, the myths that form out of them are liable to tell us more about ourselves than what actually historically happened. So I'm wrapping up now. What isn't the Sarajevo assassination if not a handy symbol for however we wish to make sense of the world? Well, that's certainly taking things too far, and the point here is not to strike an uncritical blow at such construals as we've seen in this talk. Rather, my aim is to illustrate and analyze the range of means by which the Archduke's assassination has been incorporated into our collective lexicon, thus lending it the kind of mythical quality that comes from both too much attention to the details, the warnings, the wrong turn, the sandwich, and too little appreciation for the larger historical context in which the assassination occurred and the truly decisive actions that took place in its immediate aftermath. But as we all very well know, history is always complicating things, and the origins of World War I are very, very complicated. Memory, on the other hand, is what makes the past really interesting and fun. So, an unforgettable finale. There he is, back to Houdini. In the end, 12 stories above ground and upside down, Houdini escaped the straitjacket. Ta-da! In questions and answers, I can tell you how. A feat of unbelievable physicality that he performed regularly. Escaping his own memory, however, proved impossible. Certainly there was no way for the magician to know that at this moment of mental torment, that the death that day of the Duke he didn't warn would affect each and every person madly applauding him in Midtown Manhattan, not to mention most of the rest of humanity. Unless, of course, the amazing Houdini really did have mystical powers. There's no hint of this in the novel, though there is one thing about the conjurer that connects the coming calamity to his troubling memory. For all his renown, Doctoro's Houdini detests himself. Despite his prodigious talents, he regards his professional work as pure fakery and empty entertainment. The legendary illusionist longs for the kind of legitimacy we associate with history rather than memory. Truth instead of trickery. Or as Houdini says in the novel, quote, "There was a kind of act that used the real world for its stage. He couldn't touch it. For all his achievement, he was a trickster, an illusionist, a mere magician. What was the sense of his life if people walked out of the theater and forgot him? The real world act was what got into the history books." End quote. Gavrilo Princip could certainly attest to that. What he did on the 28th instance of June 1914 at 10:50 a.m. was definitely no illusion, let alone an accident, even if his opportunity to make history arrived accidentally. Moreover, not only did it get into the Bosnian teen into the textbooks and smud-caked Sarajevo onto the maps, in 1999, several people crowned Princip, quote, the most important person in the 20th century, end quote. Single-handedly, it has been said, Gavrilo Princip ended Europe's golden age. And for almost 4 decades, his footprints were set into the pavement on the street corner that started the 20th century. There's the footprints, and there's the street corner that started the 20th century. Just like those of Hollywood legends in front of Grauman's Chinese Theater in L.A. A museum was even devoted to Princip's daring, and in 2014, Serbs erected 2 statues of Princip, and tourists flooded into Sarajevo to hear the Vienna Philharmonic try to harmonize the past with the present. And it all happened because some terminally ill student somehow found himself at the right intersection at the right millisecond, all the while eating a sandwich. Harry Houdini was right. His entire life's work would never compete with a real-world act like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It was much too magical. Thanks.
That's great. I could hear it bits and pieces as I try to get more people into the room here. I think we've set a record for how many we've been able to squish into this space. It's over 40 at this point. So we have a few minutes for questions. I'm going to have to be an evil time master today. We have something else happening in this room just a minute or two after 1 o'clock. So I see about 14 minutes until 1 o'clock. So
you're welcome to email me any questions too. It's McDaniel College. You can find my email address easily.
So questions.
I guess just when you were combining the novel Ragtime with the real Houdini things, I wasn't 100% clear. Did Houdini in real life actually say he had this warning, or was that totally in the novel?
It's completely fictional. Okay. Yeah. I did that on purpose because it's just, kind of creates this. He wasn't hanging upside down over Midtown. He did that a lot. All over the world he did that. But yeah.
Anyway, there were 100 dukes in the world at the time.
Sorry? There were
hundreds of dukes in the
There were
world
other
at the time.
archdukes, right? There were other heirs around, but he was the heir, right? He was, yeah.
And for questions, I'll just ask all of you to speak up so that this gets into the webcast that will come in a few months.
Chalmers Hood. Another French historian out at Mason, before you wrote this, said of memory studies and history, that history could no longer be taught to the current American generation because they've lost plot. They don't understand it. And the only way to penetrate is shifting to memory studies.
Mm-hmm.
You
Well,
explain
yeah,
that?
yeah. In another piece that I've written, it's actually a podcast, so I can give you the website for that through Oxford University, that's First World War I series. I kind of argue that. I say the sandwich story is completely ridiculous. You need the history. Students need the history. But because of the sandwich story, the students remember the history. And that's relevant. And I say in the webcast, I feel sort of heretical saying this as an historian, as an academic historian, but nonetheless, I think that does. But when my students, when I tell them, oh no, that's completely fictional, they're shocked. And then I said, it just so happens that you've got the guy for your professor this semester who, did this webcast on this very issue. So it's kind of ironic. Yeah.
I was thinking about your point about the memory studies being subjective, and in some sense it's actually objective as well, because when we write history about memory, we're trying to be objective about what people's real memories are, right?
Absolutely,
And so much
yeah.
as we can, and so we're
Good
still
point.
being objective when studying memory.
Yeah.
And also studying subjective memory has been gone on way before, like thinking about the memories of kings, or like those memories have always been taken care
Yeah.
of, right?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Wendy?
I'd like to quickly follow up on that point about memory being objective as well, mainly because you have these memories, but you're still trying to make sense of them in a way that's intelligible.
I guess you could say I'm using memory as a catch-all term in a way. I'm taking all these various examples from literature, from film, from monuments, things like this, and grouping them all as memory, and I'm studying them objectively and as a historian for meaning, like first victims of the First World War, something like that, right? And yet, in this paper, I'm also incorporating what is considered academic histories and showing the ways in which some of these mnemonic sayings and phrases and ideas, like that the assassination was random, have filtered into history writings. So I'm not so much scorning history as pointing out that history itself has subjectivities built into it, I guess you could say. But it's a great point. Thank you.
Lena Lagerchuk, you mentioned Fitzgerald. How about Ernest Hemingway?
Ernest Hemingway.
Writing on
Does he
World
have
War-
something on the Sarajevo assassination?
He has writing on World War I.
Yes, he has this famous, no, The Sun Also Rises is not, I'll call it, right. Farewell to Arms. Farewell to Arms is his novel on World War I. But I don't think it mentions the Sarajevo assassination. If I'm wrong, I would love, you bring up a good point actually, because how do you find sources for a project like this? I mean, I hadn't read F. Scott Fitzgerald's short story before. So first of all, if you don't have an internet, you're really hurting. So this project would have been much harder when I was a grad student and the internet didn't exist, right? Secondly, you meet people who have references for you. I make a reference in something else I've written to a philosopher, John Searle. I happened to meet a philosophy student in a gym in Belgrade, and he said, oh yeah, John Searle uses the assassination to illustrate something about intentionalism. So these are the ways in which I discover things. And people at talks often point out things. There's a famous Nobel Prize-winning Iceland writer, Halldór Laxness, maybe some of you have heard of him, who references the Sarajevo assassination in a funny way because the World War I is nothing but good for Iceland. I mean, commerce really picks up. Trade, it's true of U.S. as well until we actually get in it. We profit tremendously, so yeah. But I have to look on Hemingway. I'll Google Hemingway, Sarajevo, see if anything comes up. Yeah.
I'm confident.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Was there a decision by the government to get rid of those footsteps? I mean, I just didn't know.
Great question. So what happened was the footsteps were created by socialist Yugoslavia after 1945. They were put in the pavement in 1953, and the museum was created. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt visited the museum that summer and writes about it in one of her daily articles. And in 1992, when the war began, memory also divided. So under socialist Yugoslavia, you had fraternity, brotherhood, unity and brotherhood, right? Jedinstvo i, why am I suddenly forgetting the phrase? Help me out here. Bratstvo i jedinstvo, right? Brotherhood and unity. What? Right, exactly. Thank you. Bratstvo i jedinstvo, unity, and then the war began in 1992, and all of a sudden the Bosnian Muslims and the Croats decided, no, the assassin was no great hero, because we were part of Austria-Hungary back then, and that was a great empire. We were already in Europe, okay? And he only is a hero today for Serbs and Bosnian Serbs. So we don't know what happened to the footsteps. There are various stories. It seems they were torn out of the pavement at some point. And then they disappeared. After the war, there was an effort there were many different ideas as to what we should do with the site now. One was to put the footprints back, because they don't necessarily have to be worshipful in meaning, right? They can just exist there. And also have the huge monument to Franz Ferdinand and his wife that was constructed by the Austrians and dedicated on June 28th, 1917, in the middle of the war, a year before Austria is going to collapse, okay? And to put both of those, and a part of that huge memorial is actually in the Austrian, or in the Sarajevo Art Museum. You can go see it. That never happened. But they did recast the footprints, but they were never put back in. And today there's a museum of the Austro-Hungarian period, and there's a plaque, and the plaque could also be discussed in terms of memory. It basically says, on this place this happened. But it's a memory device telling you that history directly, on this place, Gavrilo Princip shot and killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. That's all it says today. And interestingly, rather than being in Latin Serbo-Croatian and Cyrillic Serbo-Croatian, it's in English and Serbo-Croatian in Latin letters. So it's tourist oriented.
And that museum is gone.
No, it's a new museum called... The worshipful Princip part is gone, in my estimation, and in an article I've written on the memory in Yugoslavia and the former Yugoslavia, I argue that it has now gone in the other direction, because there is a massive, and inside when it was the Princip museum, there were busts of Princip and he was glorified. Now there's a huge, massive, taller than a person, statues of Franz Ferdinand and his wife in wax as they're coming out of the city hall into the sunlight of their last living moments. So I think you can interpret that. And there's a beautiful portrait of the pair and things like that. So, yeah.
Anyone last question? I will just add one thing before we thank Paul. Our specialist for the South Slavic countries is Angela Cannon. Angela, could you stand just for a second so we can all see your sunbeam of a face? And Angela, do you have any cards with you today? Okay. You know, we do have really incredible South Slavic collections, and Angela is our curator for those. If you have questions about the collections and you want to get in touch with her later or now, do get her card from her. Well, help me thank Paul again. This was just incredible. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.